What's good? It's Woog. Please like the video, subscribe to the channel if you are into the fight talk. We have Danny Garcia, 36 wins and 3 losses, taking on Jose Benavidez Jr, 27 wins, 1 loss, and 1 draw. This fight is the first of Danny Garcia's new foray into the 154-pound weight class, which really has a lot of fight fans skeptical. You know, Danny Garcia, we knew him to be a absolute killer at 140, a very good fighter at 147. Belt holder, he had won it in a vacant title bout against Robert the Ghost Guerrero. This was kind of a faded Robert Guerrero as well. But he has held a belt and he's fought ultra competitively against the best of the division. He's fought a super close split decision loss versus Keith Thurman. He's fought a very close unanimous decision loss against Sean Porter. And then most recently in December 5th of 2020, fought competitively, but in a clear decision loss against Errol Spence Jr. So after the loss against Spence, Danny Garcia basically was out of the ring for over a year and a half. And now with his new 154-pound ambition, you know, his first opponent is going to be Jose Benavidez Jr, who nobody really sees as a elite or near elite 154-pounder, because Jose Benavidez has had most of his career at welterweight 147, and he only has 1 loss, and that was to Terence Crawford in 2018, and this was a couple of years after Jose Benavidez got shot in the leg outside of his home in Arizona walking his dog, which has been known to be the big factor that has derailed his otherwise very promising career. Jose Benavidez Jr, older brother to David Benavidez, and it's almost like a Andre Dirrell, Anthony Dirrell situation where Andre Dirrell was the big blue chipper coming out of the amateurs. Like Paulie Malignaggi said that Andre Dirrell is the most impressive young amateur fighter that he had ever seen, but Andre Dirrell hit pitfalls in the professional ranks, whereas Anthony Dirrell, a cancer survivor, actually went on to have a better professional career, becoming a 2-time champion at 168. But a lot of the degradation or apparent degradation in Jose Benavidez Jr, again, former super promising fighter where he was sparring against some of the best in the game as a late teen, early 20s fighter. So Jose Benavidez Jr. and the degradation that we've seen in his abilities has been attributed to getting shot in the leg. So he's still trying to get back to top form, back to 100%, and a lot of people have pretty much written him off at this point, but this is the first opponent that Danny Garcia is choosing to fight at 154. And, you know, a lot of the skepticism comes because a lot of people can't picture Danny Garcia, who was never a big 147. Danny Garcia is like about, what, 5'8", doesn't have long arms, so it doesn't look like he's got the type of frame or build to naturally develop and grow into the bigger weight classes. And then when you look at some of the talent at 154, obviously you have the undisputed champion Jermell Charlo, who you would think Danny Garcia is ultimately gunning for because Jermell Charlo's the head honcho at 154. A lot of people wouldn't love Danny Garcia's chances there, but even when you look at some of the top contenders like, you know, Tony Harrison, Sebastian Fundora, or even Erickson Lubin, who lost to Fundora. There are just a lot of matchups at 154 that I think a lot of people would be interested in seeing, but would be scratching their heads saying, I don't know, Danny. I mean, even if you look at, say, Jason Rosario, I think that that would be a very tough match for Danny Garcia. But yeah, Danny Garcia, it's not for lack of being a quality fighter. I mean, we first remember him down at 140, and you know, he was given a lot of big name veterans when Danny Garcia was on the come up. So he was able to fight like Nate Campbell in 2011, Kendall Holt in 2011. These were names that were ringing just a few years prior to that. But I really started taking note of Danny Garcia when he was in there with Erik Morales, who really had no business fighting, you know, 140-pound stud Danny Garcia. I'm watching this thinking, what is Erik Morales doing? Because he had like the 3-year layoff, and then he came back and fought like Marcos Maidana, and he fought Danny Garcia. So, you know, Erik Morales was a former super bantamweight. We're talking 122, who now at the twilight of his career finds himself at 140 fighting this young stud Danny Garcia, who beat him via convincing decision, but it was the fight after that that really put Danny Garcia on the map, and that was against Amir Khan, who was a legit elite fighter, former champion at 140, one of the best at 140. I mean, the dream match for Amir Khan for some time was Amir Khan versus Timothy Bradley. That was a matchup that a lot of fight fans wanted to see. It never happened. But Amir Khan versus Danny Garcia, Amir Khan was the favorite. Amir Khan was winning probably 2 out of the first 3 rounds and then got blasted in an exchange where Danny Garcia hit him with an overhand, put him on his back, ended up dropping him 2 more times. And, you know, Amir Khan was doing everything he could to survive, moving around the ring, but Danny Garcia was just hunting him down at that point, ended up finishing him. Again, this was a sensational TKO victory in 2012, and that was what won Danny Garcia the WBA belt, because it was the fight before that against Eric Morales where Danny Garcia had won the WBC belt. So in beating Khan, now he's got the WBC and the WBA 140-pound belts. And then he just went on the sensational run, or should I say continued a sensational run, where he has the rematch against Eric Morales, knocks him out in devastating fashion in the 4th round, and by this point he's earned the reputation of a very, very hard puncher. So by this point, he's beaten in succession Nate Campbell, then Kendall Holt, then Eric Morales, then Amir Khan, then Eric Morales again in the rematch, and then he fights Zab Judah, beats him via unanimous decision. This was a big fight at the Barclays Center when the Barclays Center was new at this point. So he beat Zab Judah via unanimous decision, and then he fights pretty much the boogeyman of the division at this time in Lucas Matisse. So now we're talking 2013. This was on the Floyd Mayweather versus Canelo Alvarez undercard. Lucas Matisse, very devastating puncher. Yes, he had lost a decision to Zab Judah and a split decision to Devin Alexander, which might surprise some people. It's like, damn, you know, Lucas Matisse lost a decision to Devin Alexander. Yes, Devin Alexander was a very good fighter for some time. But then Lucas Matisse just pretty much started going on the rampage at 140, which included a knockout over Lamont Peterson. So after that Lucas Matisse knockout of Peterson, then he and Danny Garcia have the showdown on that Mayweather-Canelo undercard, and Danny Garcia has to dig deep, but he wins in a very impressive unanimous decision against Lucas Matisse. And at this time, pretty much that, and then obviously the knockout of Amir Khan, are pretty much seen to be the 2 best wins for Danny Garcia, even after beating Zab Judah, because of how dangerous people saw Lucas Matisse to be. So yeah, Danny Garcia passed a very difficult challenge, and he boxed so well, and his counterpunching was on point, his timing and movement were all on point. Danny Garcia looked like he had all of the attributes coming together for that one. And so then he retains his title for the last time against Mauricio Herrera in a very controversial majority decision win for Danny Garcia. This was like a Puerto Rican homecoming for Danny Garcia. Mauricio Herrera, a very slick, difficult boxer, and Herrera gave Garcia all kinds of problems. Heading into the scorecard, you know, I felt like Herrera won the fight, but it was like, okay, anything could happen, because Danny Garcia by this point is a star, and he did, in fact, get rewarded with a majority decision win. And he acknowledged after the fight that this wasn't his best showing. And again, this was in front of a Puerto Rican crowd, so maybe there was added pressure there. But yeah, Danny Garcia, he got busted up in the nose, just got cleanly outboxed in my view. But he was given the decision win, retains his WBA and WBC 140-pound titles, and then he makes the move to 147, where it starts off with a beautiful 2nd round knockout over Rod Salka. If you want to see a highlight reel knockout, Danny Garcia versus Rod Salka. Man, Rod Salka had no business in the ring with Danny Garcia. And then Danny Garcia has a tough fight with Lamont Peterson, and a lot of people thought that Peterson deserved a decision win or something close like a draw versus Garcia. But Garcia was again awarded in a very close fight a majority decision win against Lamont Peterson, who was basically looking to walk Danny Garcia down, and he was doing so pretty effectively, kind of putting Danny Garcia on a treadmill, and Lamont Peterson was going to the body well, counterpunching well. And so although Danny Garcia was awarded the decision win, a lot of people had reservations on how good Danny Garcia was going to do at 147, even though he was 2-0 in that weight class at this point. And then later on in that same year, 2015, Garcia stops an aging but still pretty good Paulie Malignaggi. stopped him in the 9th round and pretty much was winning the vast majority of the rounds at this point. So Danny Garcia not only hits hard, but he is a pretty damn good boxer. I don't know if he's given the full credit for that, mainly because we have seen him outboxed a couple times by, Mauricio Herrera and such, and then he lost a couple of fights where he was fighting the elite in the division, Keith Thurman, Errol Spence, Shawn Porter. So after beating Malignaggi, Danny Garcia fights Robert Guerrero for that vacant WBC welterweight title. He beats Guerrero via unanimous decision. Then he knocks out Samuel Vargas in the 7th round. Then he has that showdown where it's a unification fight, WBC, WBA at 147 against Keith Thurman, who is seen to be, one of the 2 or 3 best fighters in the, we'll call it the post-Floyd Mayweather, Manny Pacquiao era. Even though Manny Pacquiao was still around, he was more so fighting the Jeff Horns, Timothy Bradley a 3rd time. This was kind of that part of his career. So at this point, Keith Thurman and probably Kell Brook are seen to be the best welterweights. And Danny Garcia fights a super competitive fight with Keith Thurman, but Keith Thurman does just enough to kind of edge a 115 to 113-ish, 116 to 112-ish close split decision win over Danny Garcia. So that's how close this fight was, a split decision win. So Danny Garcia loses the WBC belt, and then he comes back about a year later to knock out Brandon Rios in the 9th round, another devastating knockout for Danny Garcia. He's got a few of those to his credit. It's like, if you're not on the same level in the sweet science as Danny Garcia, usually he finds a way to get you out of there, and he did so against Brandon Rios. And then he has a fight against Shawn Porter for the then vacant WBC 147 belt, and Shawn Porter actually boxed pretty damn well from the outside on this one. He was, still rambunctious, still collapsing the pocket, throwing both hands and just, keeping that constant work rate high, but he was a lot more measured against Danny Garcia, kind of showing a new element to his game, jabbing very well, and just kind of showing those sweet science elements more than we were used to seeing in recent fights for Shawn Porter. So Shawn Porter ends up winning a close, unanimous decision win over Danny Garcia. So now Danny Garcia has lost to Keith Thurman and Shawn Porter. Then he comes back, knocks out Adrian Granados in the 7th round, ends up fighting a clear but slightly less than impressive unanimous decision win over Ivan Redkach. Ivan Redkach, a good, not a great fighter. Danny Garcia was pretty much winning the rounds from the beginning of the fight, but was unable to get Ivan Redkach out of there, but pretty much dominated much of that fight. It just looked a little bit lackluster, but it was a very clear win for Danny Garcia, and that's what led to the showdown against Errol Spence Jr., where this was a closer fight than I think people will remember it as. Like, if you rewatch it, you see that Errol Spence Jr. wasn't just having his way with Danny Garcia. Yes, he did start opening up and running away with the scorecards in the last few rounds of the fight. But for the first 6 rounds or so, you hear a lot of arguing between, I think it was Joe Goosen and Lennox Lewis, about how in control Errol Spence was and what he needed to do to really assert control. But Danny Garcia was having some success. It was just that Errol Spence Jr.'s angles and his constant right jab and all of the probing that he does and the moving of one's head that he does with his glove, with his lead right glove, it was really starting to have an effect with Danny Garcia when Errol Spence was then pairing that right-handed activity with left-handed punches to the body. It started taking its toll on Danny Garcia, but Danny Garcia, a super durable fighter who ends up going the distance with Errol Spence and losing via unanimous decision. So Errol Spence, a power puncher, one of the absolute best fighters in the sport. I still have Errol Spence number 2 on my pound-for-pound list, and this was when Errol Spence was returning from that devastating car accident, and a lot of people wondered how Errol Spence was going to look in his return. In fact, I actually picked Danny Garcia to beat Errol Spence via close decision because I had that many questions about how Errol Spence was going to recover from such a crazy car accident. So this fight took place in December of 2020, and Danny Garcia has been out of the ring since. Yes, he's been managing his finances well. Yes, he's deep in the real estate game. So he's got a lot of things going for him that make it so he doesn't need boxing. But apparently he really still loves the game, and he's making his return against Jose Benavidez Jr. And again, he's doing this at 154. So this is Danny Garcia's 154-pound debut. And Benavidez Jr., again, was a very highly touted amateur coming up, and he won his first like 20-something fights. He was working up the ranks. A lot of, commentators and the talking heads basically were just saying glowing things about Jose Benavidez and his ability because, Jose Benavidez, like his brother, has outsized height for his division. So think about this. Jose Benavidez Jr. was at 147 at 6 feet tall. Sometimes he was listed at 5'11", but he's basically a 6-footer, or was a 6-footer at 147. So he kind of had like a bullying style like David Benavidez, but he also has some sweet science ability to where he was able to, beat Mauricio Herrera via unanimous decision. This is way back in 2014. So he started building his name off of other names. And then again, everything just comes to a grinding halt when he gets shot in 2016. So at this time, his last fight was against Francisco Santana, where, he had he being Benavidez, won a clear unanimous decision in a 10-rounder. So at this point, he's 25-0. Then he gets shot in the leg, doesn't return to the ring for almost 2 years. And when he does, it's against lesser competition, just trying to get his bearings back. So he comes back, fights against Matthew Strode, TKOs him in the 8th round in an 8-round fight. So just the fact that he was coming back to an 8-rounder where he had fought a 12-rounder before, winning, the interim light welterweight title, that type of thing. Which, by the way, is another thing to note. He was actually coming up at 140. He wasn't even a welterweight. He was a light welterweight when he was winning those lesser belts against Mauricio Herrera, Jose Benavidez Jr. And then he got shot in the leg a couple fights after going to 147, makes his return against Matthew Strode, and then he fights again against Frank Rojas. He ends up knocking Frank Rojas out in the 1st round. So he's having success in his 2 fights since being shot, but it's against lesser competition. And then he fights Terence Crawford in October of 2018. And this was Terence Crawford's 2nd fight at 147. So his first fight was winning a belt at 147. It was the WBO belt, the one that he still has to this day, against Jeff Horn. That was Terence Crawford's welterweight debut. So his 2nd fight was against Jose Benavidez Jr. And, in the early rounds, Jose Benavidez Jr. looked like kind of a bully against Terence Crawford. He was backing him up a little bit. He wasn't landing a ton of effective shots, but he did hurt Terence Crawford to the body. Not where Terence Crawford takes a knee or is grimacing or anything like that, but you could see that Terence Crawford stepped away in a funny way when Benavidez kind of faked like he was going to go high and then lands a big scooping right hand to the body, right to Terence Crawford's, this whole area, super vulnerable. We see people get finished to that area. Terence Crawford basically looks like he takes a big breath, it steps away. He kind of pivots and steps away, and he sticks his tongue out. And, those are one of those signs from Terence Crawford when you've caught him pretty good. Like when Kavaliauskas, Mean Machine, hurt Terence Crawford, it was kind of the same situation. And then usually that's when Terence Crawford, breaks out a can of whoop ass and turns the tide. But in the early rounds against Jose Benavidez Jr., Terence Crawford was having some difficulty. He was doing all that stance switching. But again, Jose Benavidez is a 6-footer, and he has a very kind of demonstrative style. So he'll throw a couple punches and then egg you on to try to challenge you to come, meet him in the middle of the ring. Let's have some exchanges. So Terence Crawford, I would say by maybe the 4th or 5th round, things started swinging in Terence Crawford's favor more demonstratively. And then you would hear, Timothy Bradley start making note of Jose Benavidez's, lack of energy, lack of movement, and basically citing that Terence Crawford was breaking him down by this point. So this started getting a lot of the chatter going about, has Jose Benavidez Jr. recovered fully from getting shot in the leg? And Terence Crawford ends up stopping Benavidez in the final round of this fight, but he was winning those last few rounds, and it was just getting more increasingly in Terence Crawford's favor, although Jose Benavidez Jr. was showing a ton of heart in this fight. ended up getting stopped in the final round, and then he had one more fight after that, but it was like 3 years later. So it was from 2018 to 2021 where Jose Benavidez Jr. was out of the ring. So a lot of people thought that he was kind of half retired and wondered if he was ever going to come back to boxing. And then Benavidez finally makes his return at 154 against Francisco Emmanuel Torres, and this one ends up being a majority draw. Jose Benavidez did not look good in this one. His movement didn't look great. His reflexes looked okay, but he had good reflexes even at his best at 140. He had pretty good reflexes, but they weren't like lightning sharp. He was more somebody who was applying the intelligent pressure and able to overwhelm you with his power and volume, not too dissimilar from David Benavidez, but again, at the time of their early careers, it was Jose Benavidez Jr. who was thought to be more the sweet scientist, the older brother was. But in this fight against Torres, he didn't have the movement, he didn't have the energy, he didn't have the reflexes. We don't know if he's got the power still, and he was just eating a lot of shots. It was just looking like a very uninspired performance. Granted, this was his first fight in 3 years, so you probably do have a lot of rust to shake off. But a lot of people still have a lot of questions about Jose Benavidez Jr. How close to 100% can he ever make it back? Now he's about like 30 or 31 years old. So he's still 30 years old. Not an old fighter per se. But he's lost a lot of time to this like recovery period, to inactivity, to the devastating gunshots. And now he's about to take on Danny Garcia. So what do I expect in this debut at 154 for Danny Garcia against Jose Benavidez Jr.? I think that the early rounds are going to be a little difficult for Danny Garcia. He is a pretty sharp fighter. He's got good reflexes. He's a very good counterpuncher. He's looking for opportunities to make you think that he's going low, and then he'll blast you high, looking for the knockouts there. Got a pretty good jab. He's a good defensive fighter. Sometimes he exercises patience to the point of giving up some close rounds because sometimes you think he could do a little bit more. Like, he'll come at you, but he's not somebody who'll go head over skis in the pursuit of you. He keeps his good defensive construct. A very responsible fighter, if you will. So I think that Jose Benavidez Jr.'s size is going to give Danny Garcia a little bit of trouble early. And I do think that Benavidez is going to be better in this fight than he was against Torres in his last fight. Again, I think that he was shaking off a ton of rust, being out of the ring for 3 years. And I think that Danny Garcia is going to have to shake off some rust, being that it's been over 1.5 years since he's last been in action. But I think that by, say, like the middle rounds, even if Jose Benavidez Jr. wins a couple of the rounds, like maybe like 2 of the first 4 rounds or something like that, to where Danny Garcia is looking like he's somewhat getting bullied or put like on a treadmill from hell against a significantly bigger fighter, I think Danny Garcia is going to start finding a lot of opportunities to get the much cleaner punches in once the activity and the volume from Jose Benavidez starts to wane. So we don't know if this is going to be like a high action beginning of the fight or if it's going to start out kind of slow. I think it's going to start out a little bit slow. Danny Garcia, I mean, he does have some early knockouts, but he's also had fights where he's kind of cautious in the first round. That wasn't the case, by the way, when he fought Keith Thurman. Rewatch the first 2-3 rounds of that fight. That one starts off pretty high. I think that in this fight, Jose Benavidez Jr. is going to be doing some prodding, and he's going to look for opportunities, but I don't think he's going to get reckless in the first couple rounds, because that is how you get knocked out by Danny Garcia. He'll usually catch you badly in some of those exchanges, and I don't think that Jose Benavidez has like one punch knockout power anywhere above 140. Like, he was a good puncher at 147, not a great puncher. And again, we didn't see him, besides that Terence Crawford fight, against any, elite or near elite fighters to where we could see Jose Benavidez have success with his power at 147. So at 154, I don't know, but it's not like he's fighting a true 154 pounder either. So I think that he's going to be he being Benavidez, is going to have some bullying success where the optics looks like, oh, can Danny Garcia handle this much bigger fighter? But I think that that suspicion is going to start to calm by the 4th or 5th round when it becomes clear that Danny Garcia is still the snappier puncher. and that Jose Benavidez Jr. does not have great defense. What Benavidez tends to do when he's starting to get backed up or somebody's coming at him with combinations is he holds the high guard where, you know, Terence Crawford, you can imagine, was starting to be able to get around the guard, through the guard, and find opportunities to hit hard to the body when Benavidez Jr. would kind of do this high guard posture. I think Danny Garcia, no, he doesn't have the reach of Terence Crawford. Terence Crawford famously has a 74-inch reach. Very unusual for a 5'9", 5'8", 5'9"-ish fighter. Danny Garcia has a 68.5-inch reach. Jose Benavidez Jr., by the way, also has a 74-inch reach. So again, size-wise, reach-wise, Danny Garcia is going to have to find ways to mitigate the disparity there. And I think that he's going to do that by taking another extra small step in, basically doing things like throwing a double jab at Benavidez Jr. to get him to turtle up, and then you take that extra step with that extra jab to get in range to throw some power punches, given Danny Garcia's shorter arms. So I think he's going to start finding some of those opportunities. And again, when Benavidez Jr. starts to open up, I think Danny Garcia is also going to try to find some power punching, counter punching opportunities. Now, Danny Garcia isn't as creative a fighter as Terence Crawford. He doesn't do the whole stance switching. He's not ambidextrous. He doesn't work the lead hand in the way that Terence Crawford does after Terence Crawford switches to southpaw and does certain things with his right hand, like he did against Kell Brook, stopping Kell Brook with the lead right after switching stances around earlier. But Danny Garcia does have enough intelligent punch placement and punch timing where it's going to start working Jose Benavidez Jr. over as Benavidez Jr. starts getting back into his habits of just throwing up the high guard without a ton of lateral movement. So I think Danny Garcia is going to start beating Jose Benavidez Jr. up by the middle rounds. Again, that's unless we get a totally reinvigorated Jose Benavidez Jr., which would lead to a much more competitive fight. I just kind of suspect that Jose Benavidez Jr. will still be somewhat a shell of himself. And I think Danny Garcia is going to win, but I don't think he's going to stop Jose Benavidez Jr. I think that Benavidez is going to be durable enough to go the distance, even though it would be great for Danny Garcia to score a knockout, to basically announce to the 154 division that I'm here. And so, you know, look out for possible referee stoppages or just different things that might happen if Jose Benavidez Jr. starts taking too bad of a beating. Like, if he starts looking like a shot fighter, we could get a late stoppage here, which again would be great for Danny Garcia if he's looking to fight a top 154 pounder after this, which again, it's deep waters at 154, and I don't think that Danny Garcia beats, you know, most of the best fighters at 154. I do think that he could beat a fighter like, say, Tim Tszyu. I think Danny Garcia could have some success there, but I don't know. We have to see how he fills out in this division. But again, after the first few rounds where it's going to be kind of interesting, I think Danny Garcia is going to assert control by the middle rounds, maybe get a stoppage in the late rounds, but I think it's more likely that he wins via unanimous decision here. But yeah, let me know what you think of Danny Garcia versus Jose Benavidez Jr. Does Benavidez, in your mind, still have a realistic chance at getting back to his full potential and being able to fully realize that? Also, what do you think of Danny Garcia's prospects at 154 if he is to get by his debut here against Benavidez? Please let me know what you think in the comments. Like the video, subscribe to the channel if you are into the fight talk. I'm Woog. Thanks for tuning in.